Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. The Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce is probably the most appropriate setting possible for my speech today. The RSA is a body founded on the ideal of progress exemplified in James Barrie's series of paintings in the Great Hall. The RSA is also a body that has, right from the start, rejected artificial distinctions between art and craft while upholding the particular value of each. Over more than 250 years, from mounting Britain's first contemporary art show to organising the Great Exhibition, the event in our history that more than any other astonished the world with the beauty of British craftsmanship, the RSA has insisted that art needs craft and vice versa. And it continues to remind us that joylessness of attempting to separate one from the other. Indeed, the more pleasure we take in our work, manual or mental, the more of ourselves we invest in it, the more we get from it in return, financially perhaps, but most importantly, aesthetically. What we do is what we are. Matthew B. Crawford's book, Shop Class and Soulcraft, an inquiry into the value of work, published in America last year, underlines this. Actually, it's one of the things that inspired me to give this speech. The book describes how Professor Crawford, an academic political scientist and former executive director of a think tank in Washington, D.C., discovered that his satisfaction lay not in abstract political thought, but in the practical skills needed to mend motorbikes. The argument he makes is not anti-intellectual. The author has not given up scholarship, but he charts the route to personal fulfillment found by combining his academic career with running a small motorcycle repair business. I recommend the book to you. There are precedents for this sort of approach. I recall in particular a large painting by the Victorian artist Daniel Maclise, which can be seen in the Royal Holloway College Administrative Building at Egham. Maclise's work, as you know, adorns the Palace of Westminster, notably two enormous representations of Waterloo and Trafalgar, which I return to admire time and time again. But the particular painting at Royal Holloway recalls Tsar Peter the Great's visit to Britain in 1698. Peter, of course, has a good claim to be the founder of modern Russia. He built from nothing its first Western-type city, St. Petersburg. He founded Russia's first university and its first formal civil institutions. He created its first modern army and its first ever navy, conquered much of its present-day territory, and sowed the seeds of its first industries. The inspiration for much of what he went on to achieve came from his grand embassy to the West, much of which was spent not in political negotiations, but working as an apprentice shipwright in the dockyards of Amsterdam and Deptford. Maclise's work shows King William III visiting Peter at work in Deptford. The dapper king looks on in astonishment as the Tsar in shirt sleeves saws away contentedly at a lump of timber alongside other workers, helping to build one of the first ships of the new Russian Navy. In fact, throughout his life, Peter the Great's greatest pride lay in acquiring and using practical skills. Besides shipbuilding, he was a highly skilled wood-turner, and he also made rather less successful forays into dentistry and surgery, much to the anguish of his courtiers, I understand. Of course, Peter was by no means alone in combining success in public life with pride in practical skill. Closer to our own time, Winston Churchill, both a skilled amateur artist and an accomplished bricklayer. Last month, I had the pleasure of attending a speech by my old friend and new colleague, Michael Gove, at the Department for Education. And on that occasion, Michael spoke persuasively about the urgency of reforming and revaluing practical education in this country, starting in schools. It's true, as Michael said, that for decades, practical learning for children has been seen by the education establishment as a poor second best to academic study. In recent times, lip service has been paid to it with the creation of new school qualifications, which seemed useful, but too often proved to be anything but when a youngster goes from school to the harsher realities of the workplace. The growing availability of apprenticeships for young people has been of much more value, but again, the route towards high-level skills to which they point has too frequently stopped short at level 2 rather than taking a person forward to level 3 and beyond. Of course, it's a level 3 qualification which really starts having a big effect on a person's future prospect and earning potential. I went, like many people here, from school to university and from then on to a job. For people of my generation, this was the modern equivalent of the Roman cursus honorum, and to an extent it still is, even though over the last 3 years graduates in sub-subjects, perceived by employers as soft, have felt the chill blast of recession. And I don't believe, as some seem to, that Britain, once the workshop of the world, is doomed to dwindle to a race of pseudo-celebrities and merchant bankers. On the contrary, I believe that it is British manufacturing and the practical skills that underpin it that must lead us to renewed economic growth and prosperity. For decades, people have been calling for greater parity of esteem between academic and vocational qualifications. Those calls have inevitably fallen on deaf ears, and instead we've seen a dilution of both. Too many things that are fundamentally practical have been given an academic veneer, not because it's needed to produce a better craftsman, but simply because it seems to legitimize craft amongst those who are insecure about practical learning. I would have once said something there about bourgeois liberals, but all comments about liberals are now off limits. And in any case, I don't mean liberal Democrats, I mean liberals with a small L. Ironically, many such people have done academic study no favours. And partly as a result, the academic route continues to enjoy greater esteem. Parents and grandparents will proudly display photographs of their youngsters in their graduation garb, wherever has been studied, and wherever. Such is the power of the degree brand. Of course, university qualifications have an unbroken European history of nearly 1,000 years. The bachelor, master, doctor structure is relatively familiar to most people. And even in the age of 45% participation, they retain an aura of intellectual and social exclusivity. But the same can be said of few practical qualifications, because many come and go with alarming frequency, and certainly before even employers in the sector concerned can work out exactly what they mean. That's not universally true. Yesterday evening, I attended a reception to celebrate the City and Guilds Institute, which was established in the 19th century by a consortium of 16 City of London guilds, and which remains a notable exception to the rule. But I still think it impoverishes our culture that even apprenticeships, which have been around as a form of training for at least twice as long as universities, do not confer a particular title. That's just one reason out of the many things we need to change. People speak of the intellectual beauty of a mathematical theorem, but there is beauty too in the economy and certainty of movement of a master craftsman. I believe that both kinds of beauty must be recognised on their own terms. But that implies not that the stock of academia must fall, but the stock of craft must rise. Change of the kind I seek colours our national life in three ways. First is the economic. The comparative orthodox esteem to which vocational academic qualifications seem to have relatively little to do with their earning potential. Indeed, at times like these, with many traditional graduate recruiters cutting back, a practical skill may often be more marketable. The essence of the value of a skill lies in the fact that not everyone has it, assuming, of course, a demand for that skill. And as a result, the skill has market value, which is why people like me make an embarrassed judgment about what it's worth to hire a man with the tools and know-how to do the things we can't. The same process, though with rather less embarrassment, applies to a factory owner who is willing to pay qualified machine operators more than their unskilled contemporaries. The higher and more sophisticated the skill, the more value it's likely to add to a product. And as Leach and others have argued, the higher the skills levels available in the economy, the more value they add to products and services, the more profitable the economy as a whole is likely to become, and the more jobs will be supported, and the more business we will win from other countries. And raising skills levels brings social as well as economic benefits, like better public health, lower crime rates, and more intensive engagement by individuals in the sort of voluntary and community activities that fuel the common good and power the national interest. Where is disagreement about this, it tends not to be about the principle of needing to build a high-skilled economy, but about how the cost of developing the skills in question should be shared between individuals, employers, and the state. The second area where elevating the status of craft would bring benefits, as I've already suggested, is social. Sadly, few these days describe themselves or are described as master craftsmen. And in part, that's the consequence of social change. Within living memory, the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker enjoyed social status alongside the bank manager, the lawyer, and the schoolteacher. But these days, in most of Britain, the hard-won skill of individuals has been subsumed by soulless impersonal ubiquity. History shows us that there is an alternative. When industrialization was reaching its zenith here, it provoked a reaction which eventually became known as the arts and crafts movement. This movement, too, recognized the unbreakable link between satisfaction in work and quality of life. Its proponents considered the dehumanizing effects of mass production in their own time and sought to recreate what they saw as a happy period for working people, a period when their skills were recognized, valued, and free to produce great art. One of the leaders of that movement, William Morris, wrote that the Middle Ages was a period of greatness in the art of the common people. The treasures in our museum now are only the common utensils used in households of that age, when hundreds of medieval churches, each one a masterpiece, were built by unsophisticated peasants. Of course, nowadays, much of the chattering class would mock such idealistic attitudes. And those of us who've been watching Michael Wood's current series of programs on the BBC know that life in the Middle Ages for many people was nasty, brutish, and short, and that the world from which the peasants' revolt sprang was much less pleasant for the lower classes than Morris's novel about the period, A Dream of John Bull, suggests. Even the great craft guilds, which people like Morris lauded as the guardians of skills and the upholders of standards of craftsmanship, were not always wholly positive forces. They were sometimes a thin line between upholding traditions and imposing what was once referred to darkly as Spanish practices. That very duality is found in the most famous 19th century celebration of the guilds, if not of Merry England, then at least of Merry Bavaria, Wagner's The Meistersingers of Nuremberg. But on some points especially, I think that such a romantic view of an early age has something very valuable to teach us. The fiction of the past, or at least the fiction of Morris's past, is one in which membership of a craft guild and consequently the skills required to qualify to which ordinary people could aspire. It's a world in which bakers and builders were proud of being what they were and admired by others as such. And it's a world in which people could realize the satisfaction that practicing skill can give. In our age, that satisfaction can, in principle, be available to anyone and should be available to many more than it is. That's something that the teaching institutions that sprang from the arts and crafts movement, like the Guild of Handicraft, the schools in Newlyn, Keswick and Chipping Camden, and several colleges that are these days numbered about our universities, proved. The benefits to individuals of acquiring a new skill, whether for work or for private satisfaction, are reflected throughout society. We should enjoy and celebrate those benefits. This is about the power of learning for economic good, but it's also about the power of learning for the common good. I don't want to idealize hard work, but let's be clear. There's nothing necessarily dignified about some jobs that are physically hard and dirty or just boring and repetitive. But neither should we underestimate the dignity of labor, the satisfaction of a job well done. This is a dignity which we must rejuvenate, for it is the dignity of the working people. Many, though not all practical skills, are frankly simply undervalued by our society. Yet that doesn't mean that as a whole we necessarily look down on skills. After all, the 150 applicants for each BT apprenticeship place certainly don't. I think there is a popular thirst for the revaluation of practical accomplishment. The instinctive value we feel for craft, however, must be reflected in our education system, and it has not been for a very long time. That's why I'm so proud that in the Comprehensive Spending Review, we have emphasized the importance of apprenticeships and protected adult and community learning. I'll say a little more about that in a few moments. The third area where we need change is cultural. The men who built the beautiful and beautified the cathedrals were not, by and large, academic. Even now, they challenge our prejudices about what culture is and who created it. The same could be said of many of the greatest artists. Giotto, according to Vasari's Lives of the Artists, started out as a shepherd boy. I once said that we should, quoting Ruskin actually, said that we should leave no Giotto amongst the hill shepherds. And I met Alan Tuckett. This is an aside. My civil servants will go mad, actually, when they hate these impromptu bits. And I saw Alan Tuckett a week later, and he said, I've been pondering for a week on whether we should leave Giottos amongst hill shepherds, because we value hill shepherds very greatly, do we not? But nevertheless. The name of the master who painted the Wilson diptych was not even thought to be worth recording. Their art and their craft beautifies the world still. The craftsmen who built Georgian and especially Victorian London were both numerous and anonymous, but they too created an environment where the effects of craft enriched ordinary people's lives. All that we build should add to what's there. The Victorians understood that from public lavatories to public library, beauty and craft mattered. That celebration of life in a Victorian terraced house, Noel Coward's This Happy Breed, celebrated something else too. The bonds of neighbourliness, friendship and shared experience that held working class communities together. The social glue that helped them to weather the hard times of the 1920s and 30s. Craft skill also beautified our public spaces. Of course, much of that beauty has been swept away, partly by the Luftwaffe, but mainly by much more ruthless urban planners, and our lives are the poorer for it. The Euston Road has its bright points, above all the high Victorian fantasy in Pancras, itself so nearly lost to the Wreckers' Ball. But it also has its low points, notably the leaking warehouses set amongst crumbling concrete, that is the modern Euston Station. It wasn't always thus. The gaping entrance to the station and its depressing bus station was once guarded by a vast Doric arch built of stone in 1837. Its size and neoclassical simplicity were a powerful symbol of national confidence at the dawn of the railway age and the start of Victoria's reign. A Conservative government approved its demolition in 1961. The stones which had brought pleasure to the lives of millions were taken away and dumped in a river. Those who ordered that deed should not be forgiven, because it wasn't just a symptom of architectural brutalism, it was a symptom of post-war contempt for the skills of the craftsmen, of the people who built the Euston Arch. In my views, the skills of the bricklayer are in no less admirable and certainly no less hard-won than those of the stockbroker. And admired is what they should be. When each feel valued, all feel valued. This is about the national interest, the common good. So let me digress for a moment to wish the Euston Arch Trust well in its efforts to persuade the Mayor of London to rebuild it. When we look at something beautiful, it's not just the object we admire, but the skill that went into producing it. That's why the Fighting Temeraire will always be more admired than Marcel Duchamp's Urinal. My point is that admiration for skill, even when it doesn't involve production of an object, is an integral part of our culture. I remember, as others will hear of my vintage, watching the 1970 World Cup final on television. The next day at school was a Monday, and all that any of my schoolmates or I wanted to do in the playground was to replicate the outrageous dummy that we'd seen Pelé sell to Albertosi, the Italian goalkeeper. It didn't matter that Pelé didn't score, it was his skill and the vision that fired it that's fired our imaginations. Of course, all children admire skill in sports. If my schoolmates and I wanted to play football like Pelé, we wanted to bowl like Jon Snow, bat like Colin Cowdrey, or play tennis like Rod Laver. It's not just sporting skill that children admire. How many children do not dream of learning to drive a car, or fly an aeroplane, or do a card trick, or juggle, or build, create, make? And our admiration for physical skill doesn't end with the onset of adulthood. It's part of our wiring, part of the complex bundle of impulses that together make us human. The sort of revaluation I'm calling for won't be easily accomplished. We are fighting an orthodoxy, entrenched, as I've said, in the chattering classes. But I think there is a general recognition right across the political and educational opinion that change is needed. So, what can we do? There are 4 things that I'd like to suggest. The first is to continue and intensify our efforts to re-establish apprenticeships as the primary form of practical training. It's not just that apprenticeships work, though of course they do, and it's not just that apprenticeships are probably the most widely recognised brand in the skills shop window, though of course they are. It's also about what apprenticeships symbolise, the passing on of skill from one generation to the next, and the proof that this offers that learning by doing is equally demanding and equally praiseworthy as learning from a book. As I said earlier, we need, with the help of the sectoral bodies, to seek out new and more effective ways of recognising apprentices' achievements. It was in an effort to begin to address the disparity that my colleague David Willits announced at the recent Conservative Party conference that apprentices in the construction industry would in future be given the title of technicians. But we will go further. I want to examine the principles of masters and fellows and all of the rest of the aesthetic of practical learning, once widely understood, sadly lost. And with the number of apprentices set to rise by 75,000 during this Parliament, we would do well to extend that sort of thinking to trainee craftsmen in other sectors. Second, we must reevaluate and redefine what a sectoral approach means. It's been clear, since even before the guilds and livery companies existed, that different sectors require specific skills, and that it therefore makes sense for sectoral bodies to be closely involved in designing training and qualifications, in setting standards. In some sectors, that link has been obscured, although it remains clear in others. The goldsmiths and the fishmongers' companies are good examples of that, as indeed the Royal College of Surgeons, which presides over the highest stakes practical skill of them all. And through my discussions with city and guilds, I know that the livery companies are keen to build on the work they already do. I know that the sector skills councils hunger for an aesthetic which frees them from the rather dull and technocratic form which the last government framed for them. And there is also, I think, an opportunity for those sector skills councils to grasp. After all, as I suggest, sector schools councils is hardly a term to stiffen the sinew and summon up the blood. And that is a symptom of a deeper problem here too. We have become stuck in a dreary technocratic language that drives away imagination and inspiration. We're simply too apologetic about craft and practical accomplishment. I want SSCs to dare to rise to the challenge of going beyond the strictly utilitarian, becoming guilds for the 21st century, creating a sense of pride in the occupations of today and giving to individual workers a real sense of purpose. Third, we must not forget the role that informal learning also plays in teaching skills. I spoke earlier of the significance of adult and community learning. Acquiring skills makes our lives not necessarily wealthier, although it often does, but definitely fuller. It raises our self-esteem and often also the esteem in which others hold us. Even a depressive and tubercular D.H. Lawrence found respite from contemplating man's alienation from the modern world by applying practical skills. He once noted that, "I got the blues thinking of the future, so I lofted off and made some marmalade. It's amazing how it cheers one to shred oranges and scrub the floor." As a jam maker myself, I really appreciate that sentiment, by the way. The desire for skills can be accompanied by frustration if there's no clear way in which to gain them. But if they are available, what a difference they can make to individuals and communities. How many householders' lives have been enriched by watching Strictly Come Dancing? I am glued to the television every Saturday night to see a group of celebrities and alleged celebrities learning new skills through a combination of instruction and practice. How many have learnt the basics of gardening, that most satisfying of pastimes, from watching, in another age, perhaps Percy Thrower, and more recently Jeff Hamilton and then Alan Titmarsh? What a force for social cohesion and every kind of practical skill the formidable ladies, including my mother-in-law of the Women's Institute, remain. What an introduction to manual skill the Boy Scouts and the Girl Guides have been to millions of children. What pleasure it can give a whole community to see the local gardening club come together once a year to pit their blooms and brassicas against one another. Skills and practical learning, technical accomplishment and craft are embedded in our culture. The education system and public policy makers must wake up to what popular culture understands, what the people hunger and thirst for. Show me a society where everyone has the opportunity and desire to seek out new knowledge and new skills, and I'll show you a society that really deserves to be called big. That's why last week, as part of what's probably the most hard-nosed cull of government spending there has been in recent memory, the budget for informal, adult and community learning was protected. My fourth point follows on from the previous three. We must do much more to facilitate progression. Under the last government, we heard a great deal about creating ladders of learning, but their approach was fundamentally flawed because it was based on identifying problems, then trying to nail a few more rungs on the ladder to compensate for them. In fact, what the learner got was not so much one ladder as a game of snakes and ladders. Our task must therefore be to break down the barriers to progression that have been progressively erected and reject artificial distinctions wherever we find them. For example, I don't know how many of you could give a comprehensible explanation of the difference between level 3 and level 4 and why it matters. I certainly know that many of those who administer the system couldn't, and I doubt whether I could either. No, if we want learning to be really lifelong, the route for any individual from basic skills to higher learning, not necessarily provided in higher education, by the way, must be as smooth as we can make it. We must have progression based on a ladder which is accessible, navigable, if a ladder can be navigable, by the way, and available to as many as possible. We need to make the relationship between higher education and further education more permeable. We need a better link between what's taught in schools and what's taught later. We need to involve employers and businesses much more in the design of what's taught and tested. If we want learning to be lifelong, we must commit to and protect the funds to make it so. Now, there were doubters when I first said that I was going to make this speech. There are always doubters when politicians talk about things which go beyond utility. And perhaps for that reason, politicians do so too infrequently. Nevertheless, I make no apology to those doubters. I believe that we must relate what we do to a coherent intellectual context. We must be driven by a passion for principle. We must devise and implement our policies against a background of certainty about the kind of Britain we want to create through the power of learning. I look back to the Englishmen who first raised the standard of craft skills as a force in the modern world, to William Morris and John Ruskin, to Rossetti and Burne-Jones. And I think it's high time to create a new aesthetics of craft, indeed a new arts and crafts movement for Britain in the 21st century. That won't be done overnight, but I can announce today that we are at least making a start. I am considering backing high quality in craft traditions by lending the government support to a new award for excellence in the crafts. Details are an early stage, but I think it's right that excellence should be rewarded, and the government will work over the next few months with those working to support the crafts, including the various charities under the patronage of His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales, to encourage and reward excellence in practical learning and craft. And by the way, when I speak of craft, I don't merely or wholly speak of traditional craft industries or skills. I speak of the modern economy, of software designers, of network engineers, of film technicians, of all of those in advanced engineering, all of those in growth sectors which will drive our economy forward. Neither do I wish to idealize manual labor, but I will not underestimate its intrinsic worth, for to do so is to undermine our belief in the laborer, the worker. The village blacksmith did not develop arms like iron bands by reading about how hard it is to swing a hammer. The price of the potter's ability to throw was long hours of effort followed by failure and several hundred weights of wasted clay. And the same applies, by the way, to those software designers, those network engineers, those proponents of new crafts, of new skills, of new practical accomplishment. Art, said Hippocrates, is long, but life is short. What I want to show, above all, is that our society will benefit greatly when those that make policy understand what popular culture has always known, that skill, craft, and manual dexterity give our lives meaning and value. They're at the heart of our society. Craft should be honoured and those who master it revered. So while we work to encourage the learning of practical skills, we must also work to build demand for and recognition of them. Ours will be, must be, the age of the craftsman. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, John. I'm Julian Thompson. I'm the Director of Projects here at the RSA. Matthew's had to leave us to give his own speech upstairs shortly. So I'm just going to help to field your questions to John and to conclude proceedings a bit later on. So could we just have your questions, please? We may take them in groups if there are many of them. And just before we do, please wait for the microphone to come to you. And also if you could just say who you are briefly when you ask your question and try to keep your questions quite brief, please, because we're quite short of time. Let's take one here to start with, please.
Good evening. Excuse me. John Brenchley from OCR, Oxford Cambridge RSA Examinations. I'd like to thank the Minister for being here and being so comprehensive in the areas he covered. Just one point. I'm now beginning to get anxious about your use of the term craft, Minister. Nothing against craft, but the 5 major areas of growth in apprenticeships are customer service, business administration, care, hospitality and catering, and retail, none of which seem to get a mention. I'm also very aware, and in fact I think you finished with the word craftsman, that the model you presented to us is very male-dominated and therefore would like to give you the opportunity to, as it were, disprove the thesis that I'm placing in front of you.
Well, I think that I would never accuse my questioners, particularly the first one, of prejudice. But I think the assumption that by talking about engineering, one is necessarily talking about men. The assumption that when talking about artists, one's necessarily talking about men. The assumption that there isn't and shouldn't be opportunities for women who have the taste and aptitude, the will and talent to study all of the things I mentioned, and indeed to pursue apprenticeships would be quite wrong. Of course, we want to encourage, indeed inspire, women to pursue practical courses and practical skills to do apprenticeships. Indeed, in the short time that I've been the Minister, I have missioned the Skills Funding Agency and the National Apprenticeship Service to look at exactly how we can help and support more women to pursue courses which currently they typically don't. So I'm wholly committed to providing opportunity for each gender to achieve what I've described. Let me deal with your other point, which was about those other sectors. My sister trained as a hairdresser. She was an apprentice hairdresser. And there are those that would be dismissive about that, and certainly when she trained, they might have been still more so. I think that those kind of crafts and skills matter a great deal. Indeed, I think I made the point in my speech that we should be extremely open-minded and liberal about the range of talents which our people enjoy and the range of professional competencies which our economy needs. I'm not at all close-minded about this. Indeed, my whole speech might have been described as an attack on a rather close-minded set of public policy assumptions around what is worthy and what is not. I want to be more open-minded, more permissive, dare I say, in terms of an understanding of what we value. And I hope that's what underpinned much of what I said.
Thank you. Okay, let's take a group of questions because we're a bit short of time. So let's take the back there and go back from this gentleman here, and one from this side, the lady at the back there.
Richard Bolson from the WEA. I was very encouraged, Minister, by the part that you saw informal learning playing in the vision that you presented this evening. And I wanted to pay tribute to you for the efforts you must have put in convincing the Treasury that this was a part of public spending that was worth protecting. I just wondered if you thought that achievement represented the case for the wider benefits of adult learning being accepted and understood perhaps by people who aren't in that tent as we are.
I just want to enjoy that question for a moment, because just cherish for a moment, Mr. Chairman, the point at which a Tory minister receives a tribute from the WEA. I don't imagine all of them would have done or did, and it is very welcome and warmly received, and I'm grateful for your generosity. I just want to say how much I value your work too, though. The WEA does a superb job and always has. Its history is a noble one, and it certainly will receive my very strong support during my time as Minister, as will adult community learning, as you've said. Now, again, I'm pretty broad and open-minded about that. I don't have a prescriptive view about what form those interfaces with learning should take. I think we need to be open and generous, as you have been, about how people engage in learning, how people return to learning. But what you and I know is that adult community learning brings massive social benefits. The effect it has on the health and mental health, on the civic engagement of people, on some of the most underrepresented and disadvantaged people in respect of other kinds of learning, is immense. And I said quite clearly in the discussions we've been having over recent weeks, you either believe in the big society or you don't. And if you believe in the big society, you have to believe in the power of adult and community learning.
Yeah, aren't politicians responsible for the acceleration of the power, or the inflation of the power of the degree brand? And I refer particularly to the early 90s, and I'm a former MP and MSP myself, so I take responsibility partly too, along with everybody else. But the conversion of so many technical colleges, polytechnics, colleges of further educations into, in inverted commas, universities. I mean, politicians are responsible for this emphasis on the academic, of people going into universities, to get sometimes very spurious degrees, which don't result in jobs at the end. Last region I represented had two distinguished universities, Stirling and St Andrews, and we had 6 colleges of further education, which were totally squeezed. They were in appalling buildings, they were appallingly maintained, they were appallingly financed. I mean, how are you going to turn this around when politicians themselves are responsible for the very trend that you are criticizing? How are you going to get this permeable barrier between higher and further education?
Okay, thank you. Let's take another question just quickly now. Can we keep your questions as brief as possible, because I want to include as many as we can in the last few minutes. So the lady
Yeah, of
back
course.
there, thank you.
Amanda Jones from the Crafts Council. Don't know if this is on or not, but first of all, just to say we were delighted that we were able to bring Matthew B. Crawford to London in June because I think that he has become part of the debate that's being really seminal in driving it on. So we were very pleased to have the opportunity to present him in front of 200 people at our conference. I was a little concerned for part of the speech about the picture that was being presented of craft as something that belonged entirely in the times of arts and crafts and heritage. So I was very pleased to hear you at the end referring to the fact that people with craft knowledges and skills are contributing to big sectors like healthcare and fashion and architecture, all of which we know from our research. But just to make the point that most craft makers have portfolio careers. So in fact, somebody who's making an object for exhibition or sale one day may be working with a gamer to use their craft knowledge and skill to influence the direction of gaming code another day. So there's a big continuum there that craft makers are part of.
Shall I do those two? Let me do them in order. You're right. I'm far too courteous to be vulgar about blaming my predecessors more than a necessity requires. But you're right about some of the political assumptions that underpinned policy over the past decades, and I'm pleased that as a former Member of Parliament and a member of the European Parliament, you put your hand up and pleaded guilty. It's very humble of you to do that. But my generation of politicians have a chance to change that. Let me tell you just one way in which I think we can. Further education has been the great unheralded triumph of the education system in this country, but it has been infantilized by the micromanagement, target-driven, bureaucratic culture imposed by government. And if we want to treat further education as grown up, as we should, because there is immense human capital in the FE sector, then we must free it to be more dynamic and responsive to employer need and learner choice. I've already begun that process, and we will go much further down that line. And when people see further education standing proud, and when the leaders and teachers and students in further education understand the significance which the government places on them, I think we will to some degree counter the orthodoxy which you rightly identify as being at the heart of the problem. And the second question, thank you for mentioning the other crafts. It is in a sense part of the problem that when we speak of craft or practical learning, we exclusively, or perhaps not we, but many people exclusively think of very traditional industries. Now, there's nothing wrong with very traditional industries, but it's not just about them. It is about the creative industries, for example. It is about aerospace. It is about information systems. I mean, I come from the IT industry, and I saw how the acquisition of practical skills, the training associated with that, was implicit to good commercial practice. So I don't come from the old craft industries. I come from a very modern industry in terms of my commercial experience. And I apply exactly the same logic, the same narrative to those modern industries as I do to the traditional ones. And let's all enjoy the concept of craft. For the craft of a fashion designer, the craft of someone involved in the most technical aspects of engineering is surely as great as the craft of the potter or the stonemason.
Great, thank you. We've probably got time for two more very brief questions before we wrap up, so just keep them very short, please. Just at the back there, and the gentleman's back in the white shirt, please. Thank you.
Shall I go? Ruth Yeoman from Royal Holloway. One of the very important values which underpins the craft ideal is autonomy, a sense of self-determination, control over one's work, independence of self. So if you're going to be serious about reviving the craft ideal in the workplace, will you not need to pay some attention to the quality of the work people do, and perhaps even think about unfashionable questions such as economic democracy, democratic voice on the job?
Absolutely. And we will also be saying things about the character of the modern workplace, giving people a chance. I mean, I spoke of the dignity of labour. And when I speak of the dignity of labour, I mean not only what people do, but the quality of their lives doing it. And so you're absolutely right that this rejuvenation of the value of practical learning must be seen in the context, the character of the modern workplace. And I shall be both speaking and writing as a minister about that workplace. And I think it does mean a proper engagement, for example, with both employers and with the union movement, who've done such a superb job with Union Learn. That's a very good example of how employers, government, and the unions can work together, not only to promote excellent training, but also by so doing, in the way they do it, to create the right kind of workplace. So I think you're right. We shouldn't have this debate outside that context. We can't have a debate about the dignity of labour without having that debate and facing some of the challenges that are implicit in it. I entirely endorse the sentiment that lies in your question.
Thanks for your speech, Minister. I'm from Pearson, the education company, and we work with BT on the apprenticeships that you mentioned. I wondered what place you thought practical and craft learning has in kind of every young person's curriculum or education experience, whether in a school, college, or is it something that just lies in kind of post-school experience?
By no means. Indeed, when Michael asked me to join Michael and I are very old friends, and he asked me to go to the Department for Education, it was partly because we want to realise this dream as a part of a continuum, that actually the choices that people make at school, the clarity of the vocational pathway at school, has a dramatic effect on their prospects and the direction they take later. Part of that is about having a good fit between what's studied at school and what can be studied at college and in the workplace. Part of it is about good advice and guidance. And those of you who've read the small print of the CSR, which I know includes everyone in this room, by the way, will have noticed the affirmation of our commitment to an all-age careers service. This was also strongly recommended in the Brown Review. It didn't get much publicity because it was the Brown Review, the publicity about the Brown Review, understandably, principally focused on funding. But Lord Brown made a very strong pitch for a high-quality careers service, because he, I think, understands, as I do, that if you're going to deal with redistributing advantage, which lies at the heart of my political mission, you must address the issues of the quality of advice that people get, and particularly the quality of advice that the least advantaged get at school. And all of the evidence, I'm gathering more, but all of the evidence we have suggests that the failure to provide good quality empirical advice, not in all schools, because many schools do this very well, but in some places exacerbates the disadvantages that certain people already face. Let me put that in more bread and butter terms, because we don't want to be fancy if we can be straightforward, do we? My children, my darling sons, who are 9 and 6, will benefit from the advice they get from parents who both graduates. My wife's got countless degrees, and I've got one, and teaching qualification, and our life experience. And that is a very significant advantage to them. When I went to university, my parents had never been inside one. In fact, my aunt didn't believe I was there until she saw me on University Challenge. She thought everybody who went was on television. And so we need to address the issue of information. It needs to be strong, consistent, empirical, because that's vitally important to help people make the right choices.